Yeah, I guess we'll get started right on time. I'm sure people will keep on filtering in. So I'll just give a brief introduction about who we have here today. Thank you so much, Dr. Michelle Friedman, for joining us today. Not only is Dr. Friedman a highly respected psychiatrist, but as well a very established and brilliant speaker. If you go on our Torah in Motion website, you can go through her archives. We've got a bunch of speeches from her that we were lucky enough to hear. As well, she does lots of work for the Jewish community, works at the YTC Rabbinical School, holds a chair at the Stephen and Marilyn Lieberman Chair in Pastoral Counseling. And as well, she has or co-hosts her own podcast called Pastoral Parsha, which I'd actually be really interested to hear more about that. So I'll let her continue on with that, but really quickly, as usual, we've got actually a really big lineup of classes today. So after this class, we'll have, as usual, Rabbi Alex Israel come on for his Tishrei class, and that'll be at 12 o'clock Eastern, as always. And then after that, I'm going to keep the Zoom going. And we'll have Dr. Benny Gesundheit coming for his Teshuvah class, and that'll be at 1:15. And then at 8:30 p.m. tonight, of course, we have our usual Parsha Shir. So this week is Vayelech, I believe. Yeah, that's the Yom Kippur Parsha. Yeah, I've got the dates right here. And that will be Shalhavet Schwartz speaking this week. And so hopefully everybody can join us for that. That'll be it for me. I'm going to pass the floor along to Dr. Michelle now.
Okay, thank you. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you and to kind of engage together this is going to be like not text oriented, but a more kind of personal and psychologically oriented exploration, which may be more questions than answers, more just sort of opening up different areas of exploration about something which we hopefully are all engaged with deeply, especially at this time of year, but hopefully throughout the year and throughout our lives. And so what I want to talk about today is taking a look at the psychology of forgiveness. Now you could also extend this. If everybody could just put on their mute, that would be helpful because it's a little distracting for me to hear background noise. And I'm also going to ask you to just collect your thoughts. And I hopefully will have like at least 10 minutes at the end for some group discussion. And I'll try to read the chat then, but it's just too, I can't really do my thing and read the chat at the same time. So I won't be reading the chat as I'm speaking. Now, of course, we could be talking about what is it like? What is the emotional, psychological experience of asking for forgiveness? And that's, of course, what we've been immersed on, doing tshuva, thinking about what we have done that is off the mark, feeling remorseful, making confession, making amends, asking apology. But I want to look today at the other side of it, the psychology of giving forgiveness, of forgiving. And in a way, I mean, that suggests letting go of grudges and maybe loosening memory, like not holding the memory of the grievance so tightly. And as the title suggests, and for those of us who are old enough to remember Eric Siegel's famous novel, Love Story, which the famous quote was, "Love is never having to say you're sorry," I would say the Jewish version is exactly the opposite. Love is having to say you're sorry, because you do need to have to make amends. And there is a breach, a violation of some kind of space of trust, of compact between people. And certainly we Jews are really devoted and experts in memory. Our liturgy all year long, the 6 verses of remembrance at the end of Shachris, Parshas Zachar, remembering Amalek, and certainly the Zichronos of Rosh Hashanah are all about memory. You know, that we remember God's goodness, and we also remember with Amalek, of course, the bad that was done to us. So how do we reconcile the seeming contradiction of, in order to forgive, I'm not saying you need to eradicate memory. I would never say that, especially given what I just said about the Jewish commitment to memory, but loosening memory, not having it be so ever present, the wrong that was done, the hurt that was done. So I want to look today, again, as I said, at the psychology, the connection between the psychology of forgiveness and memory. And I am going to give you a vignette. Now, this, because I think a story is always helpful to, just kind of connect to. And I just want to point out, this is an entirely fictional event. If you happen to know people, a story, if you know people with these names, even if these names connect to actually a story like this, I don't know these people. This is a composite of many stories, that I have heard over the years. And I think it's a very kind of real kind of incident that I'm sure most of us can relate to. So here I'm going to read you my made up vignette. Baruch Katz, aged 82, passed away 3 years ago, just a year after the death of his wife. His eldest daughter, Ruth, who was always the father's favorite, was the executor of the will. Several months ago, now remember, this is 3 years later, Ruth's brother, Simon, discovered that his sister had taken more than her share of the money from the estate. When he and their younger sister, Margie, confronted Ruth, Ruth apologized and said that the messy financial records left by their parents had confused her. Ruth then wrote checks to her brother and sister, reconciling the amounts and making it even. Margie says that Ruth has repented properly and that with Rosh Hashanah, in the season of Rosh Hashanah, she and her brother Simon should forgive their sister and just forget the whole thing. Simon can't seem to do that. In fact, he feels angry and resentful towards his sister, that's Ruth, for getting more attention from their father his whole life, and now on top of it, trying to cheat him out of his rightful inheritance. Okay, so that story is just kind of a setup for us to come back to and try to apply, some of the principles that I'm going to be evolving. And I'm sure other people have versions of this story or another story, and hopefully this helps you, think about your own story. So we want to think about, what is the psychological experience of forgiveness? And in a way, what's harder? I want us to think about, to ask for forgiveness or to actually forgive, to give forgiveness. Who do we forgive? Who do we need to forgive? How do we do it? Who do we have especial trouble forgiving? And of course, like I started, what is the relationship between forgiveness and memory? If we truly forgive somebody, should we be able to forget the offense? Should we be able to really fully let go of our anger, of our separation, of our coldness, of whatever it is, towards the person who has offended? So I want to go in a little deeper and take a look at the complex set of feelings that people experience after being hurt. And even like in our story, after material restitution has been made. Because in our vignette, the sister, Ruth, who, for whatever reasons, which we don't know, took a larger share of the inheritance, has made amends by paying money back. But feelings still remain. There are certainly a lot of internal feelings on the part of the people who have been offended. There is pain. Of course, there have been physical damage as well. And that, we can talk about this later. That might have a whole other set of associations with it. Certainly there's a sense of anger. There's a sense of betrayal, that some kind of compact, some sort of trust, some sort of given understanding, whatever it is, if it's between, in my vignette, I set it up as family members, but certainly in a society, whatever, that there's a sense of betrayal. And in terms of the internal work of forgiveness, I'm suggesting that some degree of letting go of the anger, of making that the dominant feeling tone, needs to lessen. And the person holding that anger, the person who is in the position of granting forgiveness, needs to lessen his or her preoccupation with the offender and the offense. Now, this is not a small thing. And I recently read a book, which would really pertain to our vignette. I don't know if anybody else has read it, called Fault Lines, which is written by a guy, I forgot his first name and I don't have it here, Pilsemer, I think Carl Pilsemer. He's some sociologist at Cornell. And the book is about alienation in families. And maybe surprisingly to some, not surprising to others, this guy who did a pretty robust study estimates that at least 20% of Americans, and I think we can include North Americans, have a serious rupture, like not talking, not interacting. At least 20% of us have such a state of affairs with a close relative, like a really close relative, like a parent or a child or a sibling, or maybe a grandparent. But that's 1 in 5. You know, that's like, if there, how many are we on this? Okay, we're 84, you know, on this Zoom. So 5 into 8, that's a lot of people, like right here on this call, or probably on this Zoom, are thinking about their whoever that they have not spoken to for whatever rift, some of which is clearly known. And sometimes we don't even know what it was. We can't even find it anymore. We can't, like in our story, you know, there was a monetary event, you know, the will and you know, seemingly Ruth ripped off more than her share, but it connects usually to longer tales of feeling that happened before. And in his book, Fault Lines, this guy goes into at great length what the repercussions are, that it's not just the two people, let's say in this sort of situation, where there is hurt, where there is pain, but there's collateral damage. When there is a rupture, like in our vignette, between, let's say, 2 siblings, their families get involved, the spouses get involved, the kids get involved. Like this is the terrible gift that keeps on giving. You know, there is an ongoing cascade that maybe lessens, you know, like a tide as it goes out further in the family. But for those of us, and I include myself, who have one of these fault lines, you think about it a lot. You think about it sort of festers. There's a painfulness about it. And it keeps on demanding a certain amount of energy and time. Now, letting go of that anger and forgiving the person who, let's say, has clearly wronged. I mean, in our story, you know, Ruth definitely took more than her share for whatever, you know, maybe she was a sloppy executor, or maybe she thought she could get away with it. We're not, you know, we don't know that part of it. But let's say, you know, she makes amends. Now, for her brother to forgive her, he has to let go of his identity as the victim. He has to let go of his identity as not being the favored child, as the father always having favored that sister. That is a big thing to do. That can be like deeply woven into our sense of ourselves. I didn't get the fair shake. I wasn't the favored one. I didn't get this advantage. And that can be, even if it is true, like letting go of that and lessening it is a very hard thing. Another piece of psychology to look at, and I appreciate that this is provocative, is, do we find in ourselves compassion for the offender? Now, I am not suggesting, you know, there's a whole literature on cheap grace is the title, you know, like radical forgiveness and cheap grace. Like you just turn the other cheek. It's definitely more of a Christian notion, although I'm sure it's much more complex. And, you know, that person was hurting in some way and they did their wrong stuff, even terrible, brutal stuff out of some pain of their own, abusive childhoods, whatever. And I can find some compassion in myself to connect to that. Now, I get it that this is, you know, very provocative. And like somebody's like, no, you know, there are certain things that I'm not interested in looking for, you know, what hurt in them allowed them to be this terrible. I do have to say, I don't know if anybody here, this is like, you know, referring to TV. Anybody on this, well, I'm not going to be able to see because I can't see everybody, but I am currently watching a Hulu show called The Patient. Anybody watching that? Anyway, it's really crazy. It's written by the writers of The Americans, which is one of my favorite TV shows about these Russian spies who are doing all sorts of terrible things. And in this new show, The Patient, this serial killer kidnaps his therapist, chains him to a floor to try to overcome his serial killing. I mean, a crazy premise, right? What's very interesting about this is in both The Americans and in this crazy show, the writers get you to feel a certain kind of compassion for these people who are doing the most heinous things. And it is really very striking. That's what interests me about the show, is how do the writers and the actors get you to feel that way? Okay, so that's obviously wildly extreme and quite different from our vignette. But can Ruth, and well, Margie seems to have had an easier time, have some compassion for what they're, I'm sorry, it's Simon and Margie, have compassion for the brother? Were there mitigating circumstances? Did Simon have other difficulties to bear? Can she let go of that? And I do think that part of the psychology of forgiveness is that when one does it, there is a kind of lightness, there is an ease that sort of fills the space that I think was formerly occupied by holding the grudge. And that there is a kind of a relief, not just the restoration of, let's say, social interactions, like, okay, now we can get together for family dinners, or we can invite people to our smachot, or whatever. I mean, maybe that too. But I think on an internal, spiritual, psychological level, there is a kind of a lightness that that fills that space that was formerly occupied by the holding onto of the grudge, the identity as a victim, you know, the kind of, if for those of us who are or have been in such a situation, the kind of going back and what happened, and should I try to connect, or should I try to communicate, or how can I, you know, change, or no, that was so wrong. I'm just like totally right. And there is no, I mean, there's a lot of rumination involved with these long held grudges. I want to touch on the interpersonal aspect of tshuva, because there is a larger social component in terms of forgiveness. And certainly, I actually spoke about this on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, sorry, which I'm not going to go into so much now, but I got into thinking about the spiritual and psychological meaning of the Ari Miklat, the cities of refuge, you know, which of course we all know, and they are mentioned all through the Torah. I mean, even in Bereshis, Rashi brings down in talking about Cain, that Cain flees to a city of refuge. So while it's not mentioned in the Pshat in Bereshis, you know, Rashi brings it in like right in the beginning. And then the text goes on in Shmot, and certainly in Devarim, in Bamidbar and Devarim, there are reams of material in the Torah, and certainly in the Mishnah and the Gemara, about the cities of refuge. And I got really intrigued by this, because I'm thinking, like, I know, how many slippery axes were there? How many distracted drivers were there? Like, how often, I mean, accidental death has a lot of causing an accidental death obviously has a lot of components to it. And the idea of the city of refuge, the Ir Miklat, is that the person who caused the accidental death flees there, and the avenger can't kill him or her while they're in that city. But there's so many fascinating components to this. Like the Mishnah and the Gemara have very specific requirements for the cities of refuge. For example, every town needs to have a sign pointing the way to the local Ir Miklat. And the actual width of the roads that connect to the Ir Miklat, the city of refuge, are specified. So I was really taken by this. You know, like, this is not an esoteric, rare kind of thing. If every town needs a sign, you know, this is like, I mean, we all know in Israel, miklat means shelter. And so, like, everybody needed to know, as people need now, unfortunately, how to get to a shelter in the, you know, in this ancient time, in this ancient mindset, you needed to know where to go for that shelter. So I started thinking about this. Were there so many accidental killers, or is this set up to try to teach us something else? Like some of the other kinds of fascinating situations in the text are. Like how many women or husbands and wives really did go through the ritual of sota? How many times, if mamzerus happened and was carried out in the way that we're taught, there should be whole lineages of mamzerus, which we don't have. So I started thinking about, like, are these constructs that our tradition sets up? Yes, mitigating violence is really important. There is no question about it. That is not just some kind of, hypothetical phenomenon. We certainly have, everybody's read Romeo and Juliet, Hatfields and McCoys, like the notion of revenge killings and the chain reaction of violence. We just have to look around the modern world in the 21st and 20th centuries to see this. But I also think, so there is this mitigation of violence that is incredibly important in terms of the Ir Miklat. But I also wondered whether or not there was a spiritual and psychological component that is coming to talk to us about forgiveness. That what do we do with people for whom there is no physical death, but there is an emotional death in the relationship, that there's a sense of alienation, there's an estrangement, there's you acted so terribly to me, you older sister who ripped off, the will. I am never going to have anything. I am sentencing you to an Ir Miklat internally, an invisible one, or even our own feelings that we cannot open up to ourselves, impulses or thoughts or ideas that we are so ashamed of or so horrified by that we push them, far down. And, for many, I see some of my colleagues in the audience, we know that stuff that gets pushed down just leads to a lumpy rug. You can't just shove things under. You get a lot of lumps in your psyche or in your living room. And so I think a big, and I, in my talk, I really got into, I was just fascinated, as people probably know, you could only leave an Ir Miklat when the Kohen Gadol died. So there's these wonderful stories of how the mother of the Kohen Gadol would send gifts of cookies and clothes to the inhabitants of the Ir Miklat so that they wouldn't pray for the death of her son, which is in itself so touching on such a basic level. And it also suggests that the inhabitants of the Ir Miklat, now it wasn't just killers, they lived in Levite cities, but I'm not going to get into that. But the people who were sentenced there because they had committed, this major offense in society, that they have power, they have spiritual power, that Hashem could hear their prayers, and maybe that would somehow affect the lifespan of the Kohen Gadol. So that whole forgiveness and how that's transacted, I think plays out in the whole, should I call it just saga or topic of the Ir Miklat. But anyway, coming back to our cities, our personal cities of refuge in the modern day, I do think that that holding on to grudges does lead or can lead to acts of revenge. Maybe not as drastic as murder, but certainly in terms of withholding, in terms of spiteful kinds of activities, in terms of a cooling that breaks apart a family or kind of decimates a tradition or something like that. So something that this leads me into thinking about is the difference between atonement, which is about payback and about forgiveness. And perhaps you tend to use that in terms of the eyes of God, but we could use the word atonement with people as well, and reconciliation. Because asking for forgiveness, making atonement doesn't necessarily mean, you don't necessarily get a restoration of the old relationship. And I think that those of us who need to ask forgiveness and to forgive need to understand that it's not going to be, everything doesn't go away. There isn't forgetting. This isn't, now that I've referred to TV, I guess I'll refer to the movie, The Eternal Memory. What was it? I don't know, something of the spotless mind. There isn't, like, we don't get a wipeout. And, that stuff is buried in us. And I think we have to acknowledge what is in our memories and what we carry with us, and pay attention in a mindful way. Keep it with us, but pay attention to how loud the volume, on that particular grudge or hurt is, how loud the volume is. Who do we need to forgive? Let's look at that for a little bit. Certainly I've mostly been talking about people who we feel wronged us. So there are degrees of interpersonal offense. I mean, there are the truly horrific, in terms of physical violence, in terms of sexual violence, in terms of things, things of that nature. And of course, the emotional wrongdoing. Strikingly, there was an article, I forgot to write down the citation, but I think it was from the Wall Street Journal, who reported that people are twice as likely to apologize to strangers than they are to romantic partners or family. That people will apologize more to friends or to maybe business associates than they will to our family. And I think we can, I don't think that's not that surprising to me. The web of attachments, like in our vignette with family, goes back to earliest time, to those times when we were children, when we were less powerful, when those early relationships that form us they're just with us forever. And it's really so striking, like I think it's the Jesuits who say, give me a child till they're 3 and they're mine for life. But I've been working on this memoir myself, and it's about my life living on this chicken farm in the Catskills until I was 14. And I was thinking, because I did a lot of reading of other people's memoirs and memoir books and whatever. And I realized, like, some of these really famous memoirs, like people I'm sure read The Man in the Shark Skin Suit, Lucette Lagnato's book, or Andre Aciman's book about, out of Egypt. I mean, both of them were Egyptian Jews. They both left Egypt when they were 14. But, by that time, we are really formed. Those early relationship patterns have been laid down. The way, the dynamics of how we trust, how we engage, how we forgive, we've learned a lot of that from our families of origin, which isn't to say that's it. The deck is dealt and just forget it, or else I should take down my shingle, as should a number of us here, and just give up. No, obviously we're trying to say, okay, what can we do with our adult competence? What can we do with our greater sense of insight, the power to act differently? How can we understand and make more explicit, more conscious those early kinds of interactions and choose differently, act differently in our adult lives? So hopefully, we can approach those people who are closer to us. And, I can't imagine, I certainly would agree with the Wall Street Journal here, that it's much harder to ask forgiveness of family members than it is of people less in the inner circle. I do think that sometimes we need to ask, in a way, forgiveness of ourselves. And for anybody here who's been in a 12-step program, particularly with addictions, whether it's substances, alcohol, food, drugs, anything like that, a huge piece of the 12-step forgiveness work is letting go of that punitive, terrible cycle of punishment, because ultimately all addictions are punishing, and say, I don't need to do that anymore. I can forgive myself. I can get out of that cycle. And I also want to make space here of forgiving people who feel angry at God, and the whole question of theodicy. How do terrible things happen to good people? Why does that happen? People can get very angry about this. Certainly, just yesterday, a woman in my office was telling me his father is a survivor, a Holocaust survivor, that her father gave up belief. He said, how could there be a God with the Holocaust? Now you could use that sentence, with many other things, with the death of an innocent child, with all sorts of stuff. But certainly it is not for me, certainly, to challenge when people feel angry at God. And I think that that's a terrible loneliness, whatever somebody's notion of Hashem is, but I think that's a terrible loneliness. And I think that working on forgiveness is really important in terms of that relationship as well. And hopefully the rich and intense liturgy of the davening that we are going through these days can help with that. Obviously, it's not framed in terms of saying, God, you did bad things, and I could not forgive you, or I could forgive you. But I think that we humans are complicated, and we can hold varying degrees of intellect and emotional responses that seem completely contradictory at the same time. So we could be sitting there in shul for the whole day, from the opening minute to the end, still feeling angry and working it through. And I do hope that the rich liturgy and all that's involved in it can help people who feel a sense of alienation, a loneliness, and estrangement from God, for feeling like, wait, how did that happen to me? How could a just and good God let this happen? And certainly this has been studied plenty in terms of various assessments of people's relationship to God, and psychological rating scales. And people who do have difficulty with this do score higher on measures of depression, anger, anxiety, and alienation, which I think we can kind of understand, because if you feel so cut off from a creator of the universe with whom you could trust, that's a really tough place to be. So how do we forgive? And who do we forgive? I think factors to consider are, like I was saying before, the nature and the extent of the injury. It's the relationship with the perpetrator, the circumstances of the relationship with the perpetrator in the present day, whether he or she has expressed remorse, has attempted reparation, versus that the person doesn't even know. I mean, that is not an uncommon situation, where somebody, the classic case is an infidelity, a marital infidelity, where somebody has maybe has not continued, or whatever it is, with an extramarital affair. The spouse seemingly doesn't know. The spouse who had the affair feels like, I really want to tell. I really need to get this off my chest. And it's really a question: is that a right thing to do? If the spouse, the offended spouse, never knew, is it a selfish act to say, I need to tell you and get this off my chest? Or is it something that the person who committed the infidelity needs to just hold on to and suffer that on their own? I mean, it may be it's going to be somewhat of a gulf between the two people, but it's a really interesting question. If somebody doesn't know that they were offended, I mean, I just gave a kind of dramatic thing, but there are plenty of other instances where somebody doesn't know, the person who committed the offense feels bad about it and wants to ask forgiveness. But how can you ask forgiveness without going through the whole saga of what that person did? And it's a challenging situation. Certainly, another one is when the person is no longer alive, like in our vignette. The parent who, let's say, maybe it's certainly we've all had circumstances where wills are uneven. Now, I didn't set it up that way with this vignette, but the parent absolutely showed favoritism towards that one daughter. And there's no one, I mean, the parent is gone, that you cannot reconcile that. You can't have that out. You can't have a family therapy session. Yes, you could have one of these staged family therapy sessions, which could be extremely valuable, the empty chair type of session, where the person speaks out their piece, or they write a letter. And I do believe that it's tremendously effective to articulate those feelings in a dyadic experience, meaning with another person. Like, even if that other person is a letter, okay, you read it yourself, but in a therapy setting, let's say, or something like that, I think it is very powerful to articulate those feelings so they're not just swirling around. But there's certainly many circumstances where the person is not available, either because they don't know about the offense, or they're no longer alive, in order to have some kind of, I was going to say confrontation, but yeah, a confrontation, some kind of like, let's talk about this. I think that another thing I just want to bring up is that in order to ask for in order to grant forgiveness, I think the person who has been wronged needs to have come to a stronger sense of self, a more intact ego. What I mean to say is that it's not, that person is not all about his or her identity, is not all about the harm that was caused. That he or she can see themselves as separate and having, yes, having been wronged, but also having the power to grant that forgiveness or to see it through. If somebody is all absorbed in the identity of victimhood, it's very hard to do anything but that. And I also think, I mean, this might sound a little out there, but I think like some of us have a better capacity, or in my case, no capacity to carry a tune. I actually think that there are certain, like, I think we're kind of endowed with different genetic capacities emotionally. Like, I think some of us are, just let go easier, and other people have a more tight hold. Now, we're never going to know what the difference is between nature and nurture. But just as we can see from our children from when they're very young, some kids soothe easier, some kids are funnier, some kids are more, whatever they are, irritable, they're more generous, they're more, just naturally, that you just see it very, very young. And you can see in young children, like a holding on, like they'll remember something that happened. I mean, obviously, once a kid can talk, and other kids, it's like gone. Now, is it gone? That then it goes back to, are there just a lot of lumps under that rug, in that person's psyche? Well, something for us to think about. I want to move to obstacles to forgiveness. Like, why is it so hard? Because it's hard. It's really hard to forgive. Now, one of the things I suggested is that it becomes, the being wronged can become part of a person's identity, especially when this occurs in a familial type of setting, like with our parents before, where I set it up, where Simon was believed that he was never the father's favorite, and this is part of his identity. I think there's also part of forgiveness. The difficulty in forgiveness is fear that the transgression will be repeated. That if you let go of the holding that in mind, that somehow it's going to keep on happening. That maintaining that intensity sort of prevents that person from doing it again. Now, that can certainly be enacted in all kinds of other types of transgression, where the concern about repeat felonies. I'm not talking about this in the criminal justice sense, but in terms of a hurtful activity, certainly is a danger. But I actually don't think, I think, for example, like I'm on the board of Sacred Spaces, which I hope everybody on this Zoom knows about, the Jewish Child Protection and now other protection to elders, and creating safe and healthy environments in terms of policies and guidelines for appropriate behavior. So certainly the issue of sexual violence or sexual abuse, and predators, who are prone to, for all sorts of terrible reasons, repeating, terrible acts. Of course, I want to maintain protection. I want to maintain, I'm committed to spending time creating policies and guidelines. And I think we need to maintain a high level of vigilance. At the same time, I think that goes hand in hand with seeing through, like, can people who committed sexual acts, violent acts, hurtful, abusive acts, be granted forgiveness? Can they do tshuva? Can they, I certainly wouldn't have somebody who did that be a youth group director. I wouldn't even allow them to be, like unsupervised in a child environment. But does that mean that they're sentenced to an irmi klot, so to speak, ostracized for the rest of their lives? These are complicated questions. And I think that in order, in a way, to act responsibly and in the good of a larger community, we need to step back. We need to metabolize some of the fire of our outrage and use it to mobilize strategic forward thinking. And I think if we're consumed with the badness of that individual, it actually paralyzes us to some degree from doing work that can be protective, to some degree. I mean, I don't mean this to get into a whole discussion of rehabilitation of people who committed grievous offenses, but that is part of the conversation. Another obstacle to forgiveness can feel like the principle of justice will not have been served, that honoring the memory of people who were harmed is really important. And you see this a lot in sentencing for horrible offenses, horrible situations. Should the death sentence be handed down? Is that actually the right kind of punishment? Is that what a society should do to help mitigate the suffering of the survivors of the person who was so terribly harmed? Now, I haven't structured this talk so much in terms of the criminal justice system and these large, heinous, terrible acts. I'm really talking about this more interpersonally. So I want to go back to that and back to my vignette, where sometimes, especially when something that needs to be forgiven is long-standing, it kind of gets, as I was saying, enmeshed with the person's psychology, and that letting go of that is almost like losing a piece of yourself. And it's hard to differentiate between the offenses committed and who you are altogether. But if we don't forgive, I think we get stuck. I think the relationship with the person for whom forgiveness is called for or is in question becomes defined and becomes dominated by the offense. And that, as I was saying before, we become preoccupied and don't have freedom of moving past that, from the pain of that situation. And there's collateral spread of, I am sure that in these 3 years since when the whole money thing happened in my fictional vignette, that those families were not really getting together and having a particularly good time on Yom Tovim or on holidays or whatever it is. So getting back to how I started it, does not mean acceptance of what was done that was wrong. Forgiveness means I can let it recede. I don't forget it. We Jews don't forget things. We actually work very hard to, and those contradictory kinds of things, remember, don't forget, we work, we remind ourselves regularly to keep in mind things that were done that were wonderful for us and things that were terrible, like Zecher Amalek. So I think that this is a time, a season of thinking about and working through and maybe airing out, making lighter, maybe making reparation with people with whom we have had grievances, and coming to a lighter place, which we might even call forgiveness. So I want to stop here with talking, and I want to invite people to, let me just say, see who's in. Okay, here is a comment in the chat. Okay. Okay, so the outcome is forgiveness is to forget. No. Is that the goal? How do you force that, especially when something very traumatizing happens? Life is full of misunderstandings on top of that. I hope that my words were understood, as I am not advocating forgetting. I'm advocating working through, seeing oneself as not just that person who was wrong, but having other rich aspects of self that will allow letting go of that piece. But I want to open it up to comments from the audience. I can't see everybody on the page, so just there's a lot of people. So I only see like 9, but I want to invite people to ask a question or make a comment. Okay, Shelley Shapiro, yes, wherever you are, go ahead.
Okay, my problem with this is if somebody does, say kids or something, and siblings, something like that, where they don't even acknowledge that their behavior might have hurt you, you're perfectly willing to forgive them and let it recede, but in their mind, they never did anything wrong to you. and let it go. You think of things too much, you forget stuff. You never forget anything. How do you deal with that?
Okay, I think that's probably something that other people have experienced, where you have a sense of having been wronged by somebody. You actually maybe take it upon yourself, because Shelley, you're suggesting that let's say the person has had the guts to go to, let's just call it a sibling, and say, you know, there's something that's been heavy on my heart for a long time, and I want to talk about it. Now, that right away is not an easy thing to do. I really want to acknowledge that. That takes a certain kind of guts. And the sibling, let's just say it's a sibling, says, what are you talking about? You make such a big deal about things. And you know, I don't agree. I don't think I ever did anything wrong. I want to ask, you know, we have 85 smart people on this. I'm sure more than one can resonate with this. Does anybody have any experience that they want to share about actually having dared to bring something up, spent a lot of time thinking about how to launch it, how to craft it, how to set it up, and then only to be met with, you know, what are you talking about? You're just making a big deal about nothing.
Yeah, I had it with with the child. So,
Okay.
you know, and then how much in a parent-child situation is how much does a parent have to take simply because they're the parent, even with adult children, where you have to always forgive them, but they don't even have to acknowledge that they did something wrong. But they can also be very prickly if you ever said the wrong word or look at them wrong.
Well, you know, listen, I think that, I hear what you're saying, and, you know, how much do you have to take? That is really a tough one. Like, how much pain do parents take? You know, I guess I would, and I'm not trying to put I'm not just trying to put this on you, Shelley, but like, well, what's the alternative? You know, it becomes kind of like an ear me clock, you know, like, okay, I am sending you off. I can't stand it one more second. You got to go off to, like, I got to push you out. I don't know sometimes parents have to do that. And I have absolutely seen that, like in situations where there is violence going on, where there is a refusal to deal with an addiction. I've definitely seen that in these kind of circumstances, when there is an inability, a refusal to take responsibility for dangerous or hurtful behavior. And the parent has to say, you know, you can't come back to this home. You can't come here when other children are here. I mean, I've definitely, and people in our community, you know, known people have to say that. I want to go back to something like a little less dramatic, which is, you know, let's say you have the guts to say to some, let's say, family members, since we, you know, I've definitely made a point that those are the harder ones to connect with. Like, I want to talk to you about something that's been sitting heavy on my heart for some time. Well, I don't know what you mean, but okay, if you want to, or so you prepare for this, you say the thing, and the sibling says, you know, that was like nothing. I mean, and by the way, you didn't come to my kid's bar mitzvah or whatever. Like, you know, then there becomes that, like, you know, okay, but you hurt me more. It can be incredibly unsatisfying and painful. I would really say, can you acknowledge, can you own that it was hurtful for me, that we both have been hurt? Can you move it at all to some place of reciprocity, of real, not right, I take that word back, real, like authentic engagement? If the person says no, I think you've kind of got your answer, that this is just not somebody who's going to be a partner in this, and you're sort of back in maybe a shallow relationship, or not much of a relationship, but at least you know you're tried. Annie Garmez, I see, raised her hand. Go ahead, Annie.
In reference to what Ms. Shapiro was saying, Mrs. Shapiro, is it just me that's observing this, or that each generation of children seems to have, since the time of the baby boomers, seems to have a different idea of what's expected in terms of parent-child communication or respect? I think sometimes you're hurt easily because you're expecting more than the child has been raised to give. Because maybe we didn't raise our children with the same level of awe or respect for parents that our parents raised us. So you have to come to terms with what you expect of your adult children and how you raise them, or I don't know. I'm
Well,
I'm feeling something.
I think you're raising a powerful point that there can be, in addition to the disappointment that your child behaved in whatever way that has been hurtful, there can also be the sense of shame that, whoa, I raised this kid and maybe I was too indulgent, or I was too forgiving, or I wasn't strict enough, or I didn't make, I don't know, demands or expectations that would have resulted in a different outcome. Whether or not this is, this, like, we go on forever talking about the post-baby boom generation. So much is different. Society has shifted in such profound ways, in terms of walls that kept communities tighter are no longer keeping them tight in the same way. The specter of intermarriage and the internet and all this kind of stuff has change things radically. Okay, I am, okay, here I see, how can we apply all of this to asking God for forgiveness? I would really like to ask other people to respond to this, because I cannot but imagine that many people don't have a sense of, wait, I was a good person. I know that, God is busy and the universe is large, and I'm not sure if I believe in a personal God or the Big Bang or whatever, but how could this have happened? I cannot feel connected or grateful, or I don't feel in relationship. I feel hurt and angry that after the life that I lived, or somebody that I cared about and was an incredibly fine person lived, that they got the horrible raw deal that they got. And how do we deal with asking God for forgiveness? Do we even feel like we have the right to do that? There could be, you could want to be doing that and feel like, how dare I, and feel really knotted up and all messed up about having that sense. Oh, so
Can I say something?
Go ahead.
I think what you brought up is amazing suggestion about really how to get to forgive to other people and everything else. But forgiving by itself, it's a point that we have to try to emulate HaKadosh Baruch Hu, especially before Yom Kippur. We're asking for him to forgive us, and he gave us the second chance. The idea of a second chance for us is incredible. This is Yom Kippur. And without that, we will not be able to do. There's a little story about something happened for me. About 2 weeks ago, I was driving and I was in an intersection, and a person came. She was walking, and I probably said something that later on I regret. So I told it to my wife, and she said, "You were wrong, you were rude." What I did, I called her up and I apologized.
But you knew who the woman was?
Yeah.
Oh.
I apologized to her, but she did not hear the sentence that I was talking about, because I started to drive and she didn't hear it. But I was happy that I did it regardless, due to the fact that I was happy that I was able to do it. It's not just the fact that I did it, but also I was happy that I was able to face it and to do the right thing, to do it. So I believe communication is a big part of all the process, and to be able to talk about that, even sometimes the result will not be the one that we want. I think the fact that we open it, and the fact that Chazal gave us the power of 3, that you have to speak to a person that you wronged 3 times and ask him forgiveness, I think it's amazing. So it's not just second chance, it's the third chance.
That's the third chance, right? Absolutely. So one person writes in, and I think you speak to this to some degree, which is here, I've had that with a car salesman whose behavior could be considered fraudulent, who did not acknowledge the fault, even when seen in synagogue. Another situation is someone with a mental health issue. I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong one, but this is important too, with whom I am not sure they have full ability for insight and acknowledgement of fault. Okay, I still think that people might not have insight, but I do think that they can be given instruction about ways to behave that are okay in society and at times that are not. And I do think it's like with children. I mean, there's going to be a different level of sophistication of the approach. But this is, somebody wrote, can you speak more about opening a conversation with someone who has wronged us? So
a question to you, just before that.
Yeah.
If you cannot face it by talking on communication, do you think writing it down is a way to do that?
Well, I'm with you in that I think that that communicating in any way is better than not communicating, because like I was saying before, if somebody is no longer alive, that writing a letter and reading it later on, the empty chair technique in the therapy can be helpful. I'm a big believer what I call the Queen Esther, way of behaving, which is like you invite someone to a party and then at the party you invite them to the next party. And so what I mean to say is I think it's extremely helpful. And somebody said this to me when my kids were teenagers, and my parents never talked to me about anything, so I certainly didn't know. How do you start a conversation about hard topics? And I found something very helpful is, I want to talk to you about something that makes me nervous. And another line is, tell me how to talk to you about this. So with can you speak more about opening a conversation with someone who has wronged us? Brother, Shmulik, sister, Margie, whatever. There's something that I have wanted to talk about, and it's hard for me to talk about it. Now that right away, it gives you a sense of like, you've already launched it, that this is not like, oh, what's your recipe for this? Or do you have, there's something, I don't know, like a book that you borrowed 10 years ago. Like you already launched, and it's going to engage somebody's curiosity. I definitely think it's going to most of the time. Now, if they have the sense that they know what's coming down the pike and they don't want to, if they say no along the way, you are stymied. I mean, obviously the idea would be, okay, thank you. Like, let's set up a time. How about we meet for, and I would define the time. I'm big on teaching this to my students at the yeshiva. In advance, say to your congregant when you're meeting, we have 20 minutes, Joe. And at the end of that time, we'll figure it out. But if you're gonna pitch getting together with somebody to talk about something difficult, establish the time in advance, whether it's on the phone, whether it's in person, and it gives you closure. It gives you an out. It gives an ending. Like, you don't want to be hashing through everything that happened for the next 3 hours. Then you might want to go back and hash it out, but then make another time. Like, break it up. Like I say this about therapy sessions, that 2 times 45 is equal to way more than 90. Like, there's just a lot that you get out of the time in between to think. And especially when somebody is saying, this hurt me, the other person is immediately, no matter how fine they are, no matter capable they are of saying, I'm sorry, they are going to be defensive. They're going to be, in some way, their mind's going to be flickering with all of the rebuttals and the excuses and the whatever it is. But I absolutely do agree with you, Karen. Like, send a text, send an email, send a carrier pigeon, write a handwritten letter. Like, I definitely think it is very difficult to say no to a request for for communion, for getting together, for conversation, for discussion. Now, some people do. This has happened to me. They say no, and you're stuck, but at least you tried. And maybe it's a little tiny bit of a nidus to build a next effort on. I just want to look at other people's things too, because people did take the effort. In your example, you mentioned the siblings' sense of injustice originated in perceived inequalities in how their parents, long deceased, treated them. But how do the other siblings deal with something which has become part of the siblings' persona that can't be rectified by the other siblings? That's right. I mean, it's not the siblings' not only it isn't their job, they can't fix it. Like, people are the way they are. And I think that we kind of work around it. And sometimes I think in the best of circumstances, we can make affectionate comments. Well, you know how so-and-so is, kind of shy, or sort of, they're like a really stickler. They have to be on time, or they're 20 minutes late, or whatever it is. But I think it's just kind of like saying, getting back to the person with the estranged children. I think that the ideal thing, not ideal isn't the right word, ideal would be there wasn't a problem. The best thing to do would be to try to find some space, some place, however tiny it is, where you can get together in a pleasant way. I think that is like, build on something. It's the same, it's kind of related to, like I say, the Queen Esther principle. Like, start with a party and then try another party. Whatever, and obviously not always a party, but some kind of connection, and build on that. It's sort of like, there was an amazing movie, Man on Wire, the guy who walked across the World Trade Center, on those wires. And he starts on, how does he do it? How did he get the wire to the other side? He shoots an arrow to the other side with a tiny little wire. And then they string thicker and thicker wires across that guide wire. So it's tight, so it's sort of like that idea. Like, you shoot a tiny little wire, and then you try to build on that and construct something that can be a connection. I know I see it as exactly, it's 10, whatever it is, 11:30. Any other points that people would like to make out there in the Zoom space, please? We could 1 or 2 minutes. Anybody want to say anything, that a word of advice, something that worked for you, or something that didn't work for you that you would? Please, Gloria Agula.
Yes, I had problems with my parents, and one day I just woke up and I said, we have a commandment to respect and honor parents, not to love them. It doesn't say love them.
That's right.
I love what they do, but I do love them. I love them for parents, for raising me, for bringing me to the world, for getting up at night, for going through all the hell they went to. So I can have my differences with my parents, and they can do things that I don't approve of and I don't think are right. Maybe they say some hurtful things, but it's from their point of view, the way they grew up, the way they understand things. That's the way they are. And I had accepted it. And the moment that I accepted that I don't have to love them, I just have to honor them. And little by little, I accepted the fact that I even love them, but I wish they were different. But there's nothing I can do about it, because I can't even wish for my children to be different. I could just go along with them and have discussions with them, try to be a good parent. So I will not end up to be the parent that I had.
There you go.
So I'm telling everyone there. And another thing about children, it's from both parents and the grandparents' genes also. And sometimes they have bad friends. And the times are different. Times are different. You have to accept it. I was lucky to go to college with my teenagers. So I learned what challenges they have in life.
Cool.
And I understand them. So I beg all of you, there's nothing like Shalom Bayit. And if there's not Shalom Bayit, there's no peace in your mind, and there's no peace in your body either. So
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no peace in your mind. When there's no peace in your mind, it travels to your body. So please, if you wish yourself Shana Tova with good health and peace of mind, please make peace with your siblings, your friends, those friends that you thought you were friends, your parents. They don't really hate you. You invested, they invested, some of your flesh and blood. Please give up. Life is too short.
Well, that's a ringing, endorsement, and maybe some people feel that their siblings or parents do hate them. But I want to emphasize something that you said, and that is such a profound truth of our Torah, that we are not commanded to love our parents. We're commanded to honor them and to respect them, and that is measured out. And there's certain actions which we're not going to go into right now, which it's a very profound thing. We are commanded to love God, but we're not commanded to feel too many other feelings. And I think there's a real profound truth in that. I want to give Toby the last word, and then we will stop. So Toby, go ahead. Good to see you. Oh, you're muted.
I grew up in an extended family that had extreme cutoffs between siblings. And there was very clear favoritism of who was loved and who was unloved. And recently, I paid a Shiva call to a 90-year-old man who had just lost the second of two elderly siblings. And he talked a lot about his brothers, and there were pictures of his brothers, and he told stories about them. And as I was leaving, I said to him, well, somebody in your family really did something right, that you had these relationships that continued and throughout your life. And he looked at me and he said, we all felt well loved. He said, we never felt that my parents had favorites. And it was just kind of a reminder of how, just how basic and how important that is.
Well, listen, I want to end with kind of what Geula suggested. Let's do our best to make amends, to restore whatever we can. And it should be a healthy and a peaceful and safe year for us and for all of humankind.
Michelle, I just want to add how great this session was. Extraordinary. And you should do it again. And I watch everything in Torah in Motion, and I tell you, you are a winner of winners. It's an extraordinary session.
Oh, thank you, Herb. That's really nice. Thank you. Well, we'll see. It's been great being with you all, and it really is enhanced my Esther, you made tshuva. I got to do, maybe I can do a little better myself. All right, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for staying on and answer everyone's questions. Such a
Love this.
relatable topic for all of us. We all really appreciate it.